I am not a thorn bush, said the voice. I am a beautiful apple tree. If you like, you may sit a while and admire my beauty. If you don't mind my saying so, said the little girl, you do not look like anything like an apple tree, and you do look exactly like a thorn bush. Silly girl, said the voice. I am the most beautiful apple tree in all the land. Please feel free to sit and enjoy my beauty. Are you quite sure you are an apple tree? Asked the mother. Yes, said the voice from the thorn bush. I am quite sure. Then perhaps you can help us, said the mother. You see, we are carrying food to a neighboring village where people are hungry. Since you are an apple tree, you could give us some apples to take to the people who have nothing to eat. No, said the voice from the thorn bush. No, said the mother. Why not? The people are very hungry. They don't have any food at all. They would love to have some of your apples. No, repeated the voice from the thorn bush. You see, I don't have any apples right now. Oh, said the mother, that's too bad. After a moment, she said, well, we must be going. And the mother and daughter stood up and continued on the road to the village. Come back, said the thorn bush. Come back and admire my beauty. But the mother and the daughter did not hear the thorn bush. After the two had traveled many more miles, they became very tired once again and decided it was time to stop and rest. They had not been sitting long when they heard another voice. Hello, said the voice. The mother and her daughter looked around quite a while before they noticed a very small man sitting next to a rock. The man was dressed in very stylish and expensive clothes. Don't worry, he said. I'm not a bad man. I won't hurt you. In fact, I'm a very good man. You're a good man? Said the mother uncertainly. Oh, yes, I'm a very, very good man. I read the holy book every day for hours and hours. I pray each morning and when I rise, and then I pray again in the evening when I go to bed. Are you quite sure you're a good man? Said the mother. Oh, yes, I'm quite sure, said the man. Well, then, perhaps you will help us, said the mother. My daughter and I are carrying food to a neighboring village where the people are hungry. We're very tired from walking for so long. Would you please help us carry these bags to the village so that the people there will have something to eat? No, said the little man. I'm a good man, but if I were to help you carry those bags, I might mess up my nice new clothes. Then I might not look as good. How will anyone know I'm a good man if I don't look fine? Sorry, I can't help you. Oh, the mother said, that's too bad. After a moment, she said, well, we must be on our way, and the two picked up their bags and continued down the road. No, come back, yelled the little man. Stay here with me, for I am very lonely. But the mother and her daughter didn't hear the little man, and they continued walking on the road to the village. For a while, the two walked in silence. Finally, the daughter said to her mother, I'm confused. Today, we have seen a strange plant that claimed to be an apple tree, and we also saw a strange little man who claimed to be a good man. But how can we be sure? I mean, how can we tell a real apple tree from a fake one, or a real good person from a fake one? Well, said the mother, it isn't always easy to tell the difference between something that is real and something that is not. But it seems to me that if you want to call yourself an apple tree, then you should give the world some apples. And if you want to call yourself a good person, then you should give the world some loving kindness and a helping hand. After all, it is by our fruits that we are known. And I'm sure, although it's not in the story, I'm sure they lived happily ever after, because that's how that has to end, right? Our sermon this morning is from Dr. Andrew Goss, who is going to speak with us a little bit on the question of virtue in Confucianism. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Goss here. He is the chair of the Department of History, Anthropology, and Philosophy at Augusta University, which makes him my boss. So be nice. But he is a specialist in Asian history, so I'm very excited to hear what he has to say. And Andrew, we welcome you to the pulpit.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor and pleasure to have this opportunity to speak to you about Confucianism. 2,500 years ago, a man of low aristocratic rank, known to us today as Confucius, revolutionized Chinese culture by reframing the question of virtue. Prior to Confucius, virtue was in China an inherited quality, which highly born patricians cultivated through ritual, learning, and etiquette. Confucius, a historical person who lived from 551 to 479 BCE, was the most famous theoretician of a world in which you could train to become virtuous. The question of virtue for Confucius and for almost all subsequent Chinese thinkers, including Taoists, is how to implement that training throughout society. That is, how to create or manage a virtuous social order. Confucius himself, I must state, didn't solve this problem. When he did once get a chance to play at politics, he failed and he was forced into exile from his home state. But nonetheless, his message, developed over many years of teaching other ambitious leaders, and the lesson that, the message that power, stability, and legitimacy were linked to a virtue that could be learned, reshaped all subsequent discussions of politics and morality in China. This is also why he's sometimes called the world's first philosopher. Much of what we know about him comes from the Analects, a collection of his sayings and teachings compiled in the centuries after his death. Most scholars think that some of the Analects are things he really said, but that many were added long afterwards. Confucius created an ethical philosophy for society by pursuing a hybrid approach, which was both deeply conservative in that it looked to the values, the practices, and the people of the past, while still being revolutionary in suggesting this ethical perspective could be learned and practiced by almost anyone. Well, as long as they were male and educated. Both these elements in his thinking have been enormously influential in China and East Asia and the world. And although today I want to say more about about Confucianism as an ethical practice, and in his day it was a radical ethical practice, it's absolutely the case that everyday Confucianism is deeply conservative. Confucius celebrated the rituals of the old kings and chiefs of the long-gone Zhou dynasty. Those are his models for personal conduct. And why he celebrated them, we don't actually know. He never really explained that. Those values, though, are not ones he invented, but transmitted to his followers and through the Analects to all of us. And that includes, most famously, filial piety. That is, honor and obedience to one's parents, including after death. But as important is a larger requirement for ritual to be observed in all interpersonal exchanges, in both the family but also extending to the rules of government and political behavior. Confucius and most subsequent Confucian philosophy cherished ritual as central to the cultivation of virtuousness and the maintenance of social order. Now, I do also want to say that Confucius repeatedly states that we should strive to be good and practice humanness. There's a word he uses all the time, the Chinese word for ren, which is hard to translate. But he never gets pinned down in the Analects about what goodness really means, even though he's questioned about it by his disciples. And the fact that Confucius doesn't have a clear answer for basic questions about goodness distinguishes it quite strongly from Christian teachings. There really is almost no effort to define the good and the right. And subsequent Chinese philosophers have tended to continue in that vein, in resistance to definitions. Now, I should say in passing that this kind of hierarchical order championed by Confucius is hardly unique in the world. Just last week, a colleague of mine made the point that one reason teaching in the South about Confucianism is so interesting is because we live in a Confucian-like society. Right? Honor your parents, respect the authority of teachers and elders, and practice correct etiquette. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. The practices are different than those of China and Confucianism. Nonetheless, and this is not something I want to go into right now, it's very interesting to think about the parallels between Confucian parenting styles and Southern parenting styles. If Confucius had only proposed that order is maintained through hierarchy and ritual, it is not likely we would still be talking about him today. As a philosopher, he created an ethics that saw the cultivation of personal virtue in conduct to be central. And in particular, he was thinking about conduct as it relates to interactions with others and with relationships to others. And for him, the family was always the model, but he broadened that considerably. For Confucius, this conduct generates virtue. And so when rulers or teachers or family heads practice appropriate conduct, they acquire status and respect. The forces of the universe are pleased, and this was represented in Confucius's time by spirits, and he actually talks about those spirits. And that causes the individual to accrue de, what we usually translate into English as virtue. This virtue is both an ethical quality, but also confers a kind of psychic attractive power. Cultivating de, or virtue, is hard work. And Confucius often makes that point that we shouldn't expect it to sort of naturally fall upon us. And we certainly cannot just do what we like. We must practice the correct conduct. Virtue belongs to the person who tends it, but at the same time, it is entrusted to the individual by the universe. And with that trust comes an imperative to pass it along. And while Confucius is sometimes quite abstract about how to do this, he also has solid advice on how to cultivate virtue. Model yourself on the idealized versions of your ancestors. Now, this basic foundation for personal virtue, or for virtue more generally, is flexible enough that other kinds of moral and religious frameworks can be built on top of it. And we've been doing it for 2,500 years. The Chinese have been doing it for longer, but the bedrock ideas that come out of Confucius are flexible enough to be added onto. At the end of this sermon, I will say a few more things about Confucian social practice in the 20th century. And because of time constraints, I will not be able to cover what is the fascinating history and story of the influence of Buddhism and Confucianism on each other, which began in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, and 1,000 years later led to actually sort of a new form of Confucianism, usually called Neo-Confucianism, which is which absorbs some of the lessons of Buddhism into it. And Neo-Confucianism is also much more explicitly a religious practice. So I'm skipping that. It's a good story. I promise it is. But I want to go back to the original sort of discussions about, or discussions after Confucius's death about about the question of virtue. And in fact, this is the richest period of dialogue about Confucius's teaching, those that happened in the centuries immediately after his death. And it's at this time that the various forms of classical Confucianism were developed through debate and argument. Now, these debates did not take place in a vacuum, but they took place in the context of the so-called Warring States era, when 7 states competed for power and influence in North and Central China. Philosophy was not really a profession then, but there was a great demand from the rulers of China for political advice. And they looked to men educated in these new ways of thinking. Now, they also looked to other kinds of advisors, and the first question that all Chinese rulers had for any advisor was, how do I win some wars? And one of the things that's interesting about this period is that this group of philosophers who came after Confucius really attempted to steer the conversation in a new direction and said that's the wrong question. Right? The question of winning wars is not where you should start. You should start from this ethical perspective. And from there, they moved on to what would be good policies, good practices of a good government. And out of these debates came a series of distinct ideas and policies, some of which built with the Confucian ideas and some built against them. Now, some of these philosophers were themselves advisors, but there appear to have been primarily teachers. And these teachers traveled around China instructing young men on how to be effective government officials. One point to make here is that while Confucius's value ethic was never just about government, as we know them from the Analects, most of the classical developments of Confucianism took place in the context of thinking about governing and politics. Another way to put this is that the classical Confucianisms were really leadership training for the politically ambitious. Ethics became even more a question of what was good in governing, and still less, about defining personal morals or behavior. And I should also mention there isn't a whiff of democracy or equality in this thinking, right? This was leadership training that prepares you for a career in a hierarchical and unequal system where you could be effective as an advisor only if you gained the ear of your lord. But what it did do was lead to a large body of theorizing about human nature, because you couldn't know how to lead a society unless you knew why and how people reacted to ethical leadership. Confucius hadn't ignored this. I point you to the very famous Analects, which is reproduced, Analects 12.19, chapter 12. The virtue of the gentleman is like the wind, and the virtue of common people is like the grasses. When the wind blows over the grasses, they will surely bend. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, we've been debating it for 2,500 years, but I think surely is the giveaway, right? He doesn't actually say why the people will bend, right? Is it because this moral, virtuous force is persuasive, or is it coercive, or something in between? Now, even though Confucius never comes down on explaining how this should work, his successors took up exactly those questions. And they thought that if we knew the answer to that, we could figure out how to build an ethical society and good government. Now, speaking to you all today and thinking about the Unitarian Universalist principles and sources, I think that there are 3 or maybe 4 of the most famous offshoots of Confucius thinking who may be of interest to you. I didn't supply a quote from Mozi. He was an important transitional figure who lived in the decades after Confucius's death, and he was an important transitional figure, famous now for his pacifism and his idea of universal love. That's the older English translation, perhaps better translated as impartial caring, which he saw as a solution to the problem of socially destructive conflict. Again, remember that many of these ideas come out of the Warring States, which was actually a time of not just conflict and war, but actually bloodshed. For Mozi, the good was achieved when the community was healthy and productive, which was impossible without sound religious beliefs and the absence of fighting. Now, Mozi was an important influence on Mencius, who is amongst the classical philosophers of Confucianism, second only in stature to Confucius. Mencius argued that all people have a little bit of good in them already. And that this is there's a long excerpt from one of Mencius's writings on this. And that means that since all of us have a little bit of good in us already, good government means cultivating that side through compassionate leadership and benevolent government. And that could be done in a whole host of ways. By, of course, raising the virtue of the leader. He was still a conventional Confucianist in that way. But he didn't want people to just do the rituals correctly. He thought that there were concrete policies that good leaders and good governments should follow in order to bring out the most virtuous elements of society. And that meant policies like lowering taxes and providing for the people. Mencius also followed Mozi in dismissing military force as counterproductive, and he said that if a ruler governs kindly, quote, in all the world he will have no enemy. And finally, the Taoists, in particular the Lao Tzu, the most translated of Chinese texts. And this too is part of the world of Confucianisms. Reading the Lao Tzu is fun. It's filled with elusive wisdom, ambiguous enough that it seems to hide profundities almost within reach. Nonetheless, at the center of Taoism is the idea that nature is the only philosophical truth. And that's reflected in the passages in the program. The Tao that Lao Tzu speaks of is the Dow of Nature. Tao is not a word that Taoists invented. Confucius wrote about the Tao as well, but he meant something different. So for the Lao Tzu, the Tao is the Tao of nature. And our human efforts to push against the world of nature are basically doomed. The Lao Tzu teaches us not to press too much, as humanity distorts everything that is good, and it is best to just go with the flow. Interestingly, the word around which so much of revolves in Taoism is the same word Confucius used to refer to virtue, de. In the Lao Tzu, de refers to the power to move others without physical force. Interference with nature has ruined the world, and the quietest approach of doing nothing, or near to nothing, represents the only real power, so to speak, we can have. Now, some Westerners and others have glossed the Lao Tzu as a handbook for spirituality, and fair enough. But it's also a guide for using anti-intellectualism to combat officialdom, especially Confucian officialdom. A basic message from the Lao Tzu is that virtue is superior if virtue denies itself, a strategy deployed to prove that Confucians themselves are really the weak ones, since they are always going around showing off their virtue. Now, not all Confucianisms are likely to be sources of wisdom and teaching for Unitarian Universalists. And I'm thinking of one strand represented by the most famous of the late classical Confucians, Xunzi, who I've not excerpted. His finding, his belief was that human nature is bad. And that's sort of the basic premise, and that also strongly distinguishes him from his rival Mencius. Mencius was long dead when Zhengzi worked. Now, Zhengzi is not against virtue and morality, but it is something that he thought was created by good rulers. Right? How do you do this? Zhengzi knew the answer was complicated because he didn't want you to think that we each get to make our own morality. That's not at all where he was going with that. Instead, he argues that the true sages are those who can read the order of the universe and use that to guide a civilization based upon rites and rituals. This is in essence a religious argument, but he takes great pains to suggest this is not a religious argument. Zhengzi's thinking is the germ of most subsequent Chinese theories of day-to-day administrative rule, which was developed actually during the Han Dynasty, but which we're not going to get into. But just to summarize, in its benign form, we get, if we follow Zhengzi, we get elaborate, ritualized bureaucracy. And in its extreme form, it leads to a government and law of law and punishments, which is actually also one of the implications of his sort of theory of human nature. And sometimes, maybe most times, we get a little bit of both. Now, coming to the end and skipping ahead 2,000 years, a final thought about one of the founders of modern China, Sun Yat-sen. Now, Sun Yat-sen was a transitional figure in Chinese history. He was born and active in the last years, he was active in politics in the last years of the Qing dynasty. And at the end of his life, he was one of the first allies of the Chinese communists. He's also one of the very few figures in modern Chinese history who is celebrated as a virtuous hero in both mainland China and Taiwan. And for that matter, in the West, right? Sun Yat-sen is not a controversial figure. I was fortunate enough a few months ago to be able to visit the house in Shanghai where Sun Yat-sen lived at the end of his life. And it is a pilgrimage site for Chinese nationalists coming from mainland China. Even though the party that Sun Yat-sen founded, the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, ended up being the party that later, after Sun Yat-sen's death, made its way to Taiwan. Now, Sun Yat-sen was born in southern China. He was born into a poor family, but then he spent his formative schooling years in Hawaii, at the end of which he chose, it was controversial in his family because his family were not Christian, but he chose to be baptized by American Congregationalists. He moved back to Hong Kong. He pursued and trained as a physician, and he actually had a medical practice for a number of years. And he became active in Chinese politics around 1890. In 1905, he formulated the three principles of the people, which was a sort of an argument for, sort of a framework for Chinese politics. And this has been a touchstone for really all subsequent Chinese politicians. And these three principles were, first, the people's right to be free from imperial rule. And this is sometimes glossed as nationalist, but he was really thinking in particular of the need or the requirement that the Chinese lead themselves. His second principle was the rights of the people. This is sometimes called democracy, which I actually think is a mistranslation, but in essence, it was a notion that all people should be able to participate in the well-being of the country. And then the last of the three principles, remember there are only three, the last of the three principles was people's livelihood. Now, this has been a potent ideology because it blended modern political ideas from the Enlightenment and the French Revolution with the Confucian paternalist politics that he also had learned, coming of age in the 1870s and 1880s in China. But what is so interesting is that it was built on both Christian and Confucian ethics. What he is really arguing for in these 3 points, in addition to arguing for the need to China to be free from imperial rule, was that social justice was a central necessity for the Chinese people. And that's what he probably meant with people's livelihood. He believed that the people had been ill-served by today, or by then, the rulers that he lived under, and that all Chinese lived under. And he thought that it was necessary for this sort of new style of politics to come into place to allow the Chinese people to reach their potential. But it was actually to be implemented by benevolent rulers like himself. And there's actually, there's a sort of Confucian patrimonial system that he envisioned with people like himself in charge. And while he failed to lead China himself, he did formulate the first set of ethical guidelines for what modern China should be like. And these guidelines have continued to be influential and continue to serve as guideposts for Chinese leaders today. And what's so interesting is sort of the combination of modern Christian and Confucian ethics that he sort of rolled into this central ideology. So I'm just going to close with one thing which is not about ethics, but was hopefully make my point that Sun Yat-sen is a sort of an important figure for making sense of modern China. So I have worn this suit, which I do not get to wear very often because it is just not very appropriate. This style jacket was made famous by Chairman Mao and also by Nehru, and it's sometimes called a Mao jacket. This is actually a style of suit that Sun Yat-sen made famous. He's the first person. He always wore this cut of jacket. And I think that it was a very powerful symbol, and it's continued to be a powerful symbol in 20th century politics, in part because it sort of blends all of these ideas together. Right? We don't know exactly what Sun Yat-sen was thinking while he wore this, but this is a suit that is both a little bit Western, right? It doesn't look like a typical Chinese jacket. At the same time, it might still resonate with those people used to seeing Confucian officials who also wore sort of certain kinds of uniforms. They didn't look like this, but they sort of, maybe they're a little bit parallel to that. And finally, this style suit and this style jacket calls to mind perhaps the Anglican ministers in Hong Kong, sort of in the British colony of southern China, that Sun Yat-sen would have been so familiar with. And so this jacket, which has managed to sort of bring all of those currents together. Well, I need a better conclusion, but I will end it there. Thank you very much.